Hello everybody, we're going to do a little side project here which is working with other languages. Now, not all of you are fluent in every language, but we're just going to run essentially an overview of what we want to do. Here um, in this program we teach Java and C Sharp, so I kind of wanted to focus on that. Working Java, or excuse me, Python with C++ is actually relatively easy. Um, but I figured I'd just focus mostly on these two. Um, Now the problem is at this point is that Java and C Sharp are kind of controlled by two other companies. So C Sharp is going to be controlled by Microsoft or have a lot of influence on it, and then Java is going to be controlled by Oracle. Both good companies, but both, are focused more on making their product better as opposed to working with other products. Python does, from what I've read, most of the heavy lifting in trying to make this work in other languages. With Java, you can actually run a Python file from Java. It's not, I did two or three test cases beforehand, and I wasn't very happy with it. And I think one of the reasons why I'm not happy with it is because they have this thing called Jython out there, which you'll see right here. That is a form of Python written in Java languages. Because of that, it can bring in Java, files and classes, and you can actually run Java code from in it, and it works very well. Um, I don't want you guys to focus on this for the test. So I'm not going to run it for you, because essentially what you're going to have to do if you want to play with that is download Jython, then actually learn a little bit about those pieces inside Jython. Now C Sharp, generally you don't execute Python, C Sharp in Python, but the reverse can happen. There is something that's called Ironpython, um, but if I remember right, it's only available up to 2.7 Python. So it runs that well, but obviously since we're using the 3.5 or 3.6, is not going to do ours, and I'm worried about the pieces of it. So instead of doing it from the IronPython, I'm just going to write a simple program in Python and then show you how to execute it in C Sharp. So if you know how to do C Sharp, um, you can use it. Now, don't worry about the C Sharp language this time around. That's not for the test. This is going to be just kind of running, getting it to execute one program from another. So I made this Python thing file, and as you can see, it's probably pretty similar to what you've seen before. We're going to bring in a pyplot, and then here we're going to grab from a file. This probably goes back to one of the earlier chapters, but um, we're going to do that and then just bring that whole file in. And if you remember how Python does it, it reads everything all at once. So when I say stuff here, I mean like everything. So the entire file. And as you can see, I use the absolute path, but feel free to use a local path if you're going to do it. Now you haven't seen that yet, but well, actually, maybe this is a good time to bring it up. So this is the file I did, and originally what I did is I meant to create this in C Sharp, and in fact, I did create this in Java, and I manipulated the data a little bit so that it's assorted and in order. And feel free to copy this. So I did all this stuff and in another language, and then use pyplot to process it, which is, might be one of those ways you would use something like this. Because you might not want to do everything in C Sharp, and you might not want to do everything in Python. But they have their strengths, and so maybe you'd want Python to do the strength of pyplot with the data manipulation of C Sharp. I left that out because I didn't want people getting embroiled in the C# or the Java. I just wanted them to see the process on what to do here. So once this quote stuff it goes in, it's going to need to be split because it comes in as one big piece, and then 1, 3, 5, 9, 15, 17 are all those data pieces that get split up into a list called stuff list. And then we plot this, and then we go ahead and show it to the screen. If you can go ahead, I can go ahead and run this. And remember, I have a, hold on one second. I have a, oops, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Remember, I have this going as absolute, so it's in a different spot than maybe you would have it. So make sure that it can your Python can find that piece. And what I wanted to do is just double click on this guy and run it, and you should get a plot. This looks like a straight line plot until you look at the left or the y-axis. These are not equally spaced. 1 to 3, there's only 2 between 1 and 3, whereas there's 11 between 77 and 66. So it kind of forced that to do it. You can undo that by doing ytick in pyplot, but again, this is more for demonstration than anything else. Now let's go ahead to the C# one, and what you're going to want to do here, I already have one open, but for you all, I want you to go New Project, and then you have Visual C#, and you should see Windows Form Application on there. Make sure it's in a directory that you're comfortable with, and give it whatever name you wanted. In this case, I called it Solver. And then once you do that, hit the OK, and it'll generate this. You'll get something that looks more like this. You'll get a form that looks more like this. If you've ever used C#, it's very easy to create forms right away. So I just made it kind of more square. And then on your left-hand side, you'll probably see these 3 pieces: Toolbox, Server Explorer, and Data Sources. You want to click on Toolbox, and then you're going to want to pin it just so it doesn't keep overlapping our form. From that, you're going to click on that button. You're going to drag it slowly or speedily, and just drop it on there. So I have a button 1. You have a button 2. Or excuse me, you'll probably get a button 1 like me, and I'm clicking on this. So once you get that, if you were to run it, you would get this nice, and it has a little start button at the top. Maybe I should have mentioned that. A little hoverable button, and if you click on it, it will do absolutely nothing because it's an event. It's waiting for you to tell it to do something. So all at this point you can do is a nice visual hover over button, and you just go back and forth and back and forth. But to actually program that button, C#, the way C# views things is that the buttons, every event or everything on your form is programmable. So you can add code to anything. So I can double click this form right here, or if I put a button here, if I grab a label and put it up here, I can double click on that label. It's all associated with the objects that you have. In this case, I wanted button 1 because, again, this is a demonstration. So if I click through to it, you will not have this. You will just have private void button 1 click, option sender events arg, and then these empty curly brackets. This is what you're going to be putting into it. And then why don't you pause and do that now? And now that you're back, this is the programming that's going to be in the button. However, you're probably getting some nice squiggly lines at this point. So I want you to go ahead and put these two libraries in. So just like we did in PyPlot, let's go back to that for a second. You know how we import matplotlib.pyplot? This is essentially doing the same thing. We're using instead of importing or including, or if you've seen any other languages, there's always a little specific thing here. Um, uh, the system IO, the reason I put that in there, we're not actually going to use that. But that is the input output, and they use something called stream reader and stream writer. If you know what we're talking about, you can do that here. Basically, I just wanted to point out that we create a text file in C# and then bring it back in through Python. So this data could be generated in C# and then brought back into Python. And I always say when you first start off with doing this, go ahead and do it that way. You can do console arguments. They're a little frustrating at first, and also remember when you're using two languages, it's a little harder to debug. And so when something goes wrong, sometimes it's a little harder to run to ground. So in this case, when you have a text file, you can verify that things are going to a text file, and then if they're not going in to Python correctly, that means it's probably Python's coding's fault as opposed to C#. So let's go back down here. Now read this off. So hopefully, I'm sorry, if you, one more time, go ahead and write that, to pause it and write those two in there, and everything should look nice and unsquiggly lined under this. Okay, so the first one, this process P, is just going to give us some variable name for a process, and it can be any process at this point. And it says new process. So if you think about that, that's going to create a new instance of something. Then we go into the file name. And notice what I'm doing here. This is actually calling up what's going to write, excuse me, not what's going to write, what's going to execute this file that you're going to run. So this may differ for you on your computer or laptop. I don't know why I lost that. So what you want to do is go into your File Explorer, go to C drive, and you might see Python 2.7 right there. You can go ahead and use that. That will work here. I'm going to go into Program Files and then see how it says Python 335 and then Python exe. Well, lo and behold, that's what I'm doing right here. So if I click on this guy, see Program Files Python 35, that is the same exact line as this, and then the actual executable name of what runs Python here. So again, using an absolute path. But then we'll kind of go down here. I'm going to skip ahead just for a second because these two are a little harder to explain. The plotter py is in a local path, so I don't know why it says start the problem. Two parameters. It really only needs one being the plotter, and this is the where you'd actually put the pi. If you're passing arguments out, sometimes you'll use that. In fact, that's probably why I have it, is because that originally this had multiple arguments in it. But in this case, we are going to just need the plotter py, which is what I use here. And then I'm going to p-start, which is going to start the process running, and then it really only wants to execute one of these, so it's going to do a wait for exit there. If you notice, I don't know if you have or haven't, I actually put the plotter py and the data.txt file that we described already in a place on in the C# project. So remember way back when you said create project, you know, and you pick your file folder, and then you pick the name. That's what I did here. And then you'll see a solution file inside the name of that file. That is actually what runs everything, just like Python. But if you go into solver part and then bin debug, this is where it actually drops all the executables here. So in this case, it's if you want to use a local file, what you want to do is put the data.txt. Originally, I did both of these local, but in this time I just, oops, I'm sorry, actually I did the plotter pot y in there. And the plotter pot y is actually going to go somewhere else for the data.txt. This data.txt actually doesn't use. That plotter.py has to be in the same folder since we use the local version of it. It has to be in the same as my solver.exe file. So we could go ahead. We could write the full length out there too. That's fine. Okay, so that's actually basically it. When you're done with that, you can go ahead and hit start. Now for me, it's going to pop up real quick because I already ran this once. But for you, this might take a while. It always sets things up a little slow in C# the first time. And then you have an active button like we saw before. We got the nice hover property, and if I click it, it's going to bring up Py, and then lo and behold, it brings up that pie plot that we saw before. So you can execute it from here. And generally, that's not a bad idea to do it that way. I was telling my other students that it's always kind of better to go from, or at least this is my theory, it's always better to go from a higher level and execute a lower level. Sometimes the reverse isn't true because there's some trickiness and syntax issues. Yeah. So the last part that I'll say is some of you might not have gotten this to write correctly. You might have tons of squiggly lines. If you're not used to using anything besides Python, you're probably not used to doing the curly brackets, which are essentially a excuse me, they actually are kind of like the colon in Python. They just determine what's inside. So that's why it's also indented from the void. So this is a method, and then this is all the programming inside the method. The next thing you might not think is important, but is that they have a semicolon. Semicolons are like periods in English. They always kind of end the sentence. And then just watch your wording here, because remember, P is the process, so this has to have all P's down the middle in the beginning. Start info, one word. I'll make sure you do that, and that is not to be confused with start. So start actually will help run it, but this is all the stuff that's needed before it can run it. And then everything is case sensitive, so make sure the S and the O are capitalized, as well as everything else that you see here. Capitals have to be capitals, lowers have to be lowers. All right, so if you have any questions or want to see anything else done in another language, we can always give it a try. But this is, you know, I know I said I was going to test on this, so I just wanted to make sure that you got just a brief intro. Am I going to ask you to do C# on the test? No, but I may ask you, you know, what gave me a language that you can work with Python. How would you go about doing that? And you could say something like, well, we could bring in a library, work with Ironpython, all that stuff. You know, kind of just the methodology and the theory behind working one with the other. And then, you know, in this case, we actually ran it as a process. So we kind of treated Python as an island and didn't necessarily integrate it, but just we ran it and we passed stuff into it. Okay. Other than that, have a great week.